Is there anybody there? Yes, we're all still here, in Kansas, in London, in Leeds, and in all the other city regions of the world. But that film presupposed that one day soon we might not still be here, or if we were, that we wouldn't be all that lucky to be alive. In a moment after the break, we'll be discussing that film with Michael Heseltine, the Defence Secretary, with CND and others, including a studio audience, not all that different, perhaps, from those fictional citizens of Lawrence near Kansas City. If you were affected by that film, join us after the break. We have here in a studio in Leeds a selected audience, some of whose views we know and some of whose we don't know. The latter being perhaps counterparts in Britain of those citizens of the town near Kansas City whose terrible fictional experience we've just been watching in that film the day after. The purpose of our discussion tonight, I hope, is to try to move thoughtfully towards some certainty that that terrible experience in the film will always remain fictional for everyone. In a studio in London, we have Mr. Michael Heseltine, the Secretary of State for Defence, also Mr. Dennis Healy, a former Labour Secretary of State for Defence, and Dr. David Owen, leader of the Social Democratic Party and former Foreign Secretary.
We'll also be talking to other experts and officials on both sides of the Atlantic, including Joan Ruddock from CND and the former American Secretary of Defence, Robert McNamara. But to begin, the present British Defence Secretary.
Secretary of State, you've criticised this film as carrying a message of ultimate failure. But its message is not that. It's a message that there could be ultimate failure of the deterrent to deter. Surely it's not sadly unbalanced, as you've called it, to suggest that.
Well, obviously, the events it depicts are deeply shocking, and it has a horrifying impact on one. And I think the chilling words at the end, "Is there nobody there?" leave a sort of impact of hopelessness. But the fact is that we're all there. And after decades, when the former ministers and myself who are on this programme have had to live with these horrifying decisions, we have actually kept the peace in Western Europe for an unprecedented period in contemporary history.
But the point the film is making is that might not continue to be so in the future, just as it might not.
Yes, I know that.
Well, are you saying that's unreasonable?
What I find disturbing about the film, in addition, of course, to the horrific portrayal of the events that I willingly accept, is that it rewrites history. And time and again...
In what way? It's about the future.
If I can give you some examples, which I think your audience and the wider viewing audience will remember. We went through the tensions of Berlin. We had the statement in the film about it's just like the Cuba Missile Crisis all over again. We had the riots in East Germany. It didn't mention riots in Central Europe. But all of these things we've lived through in a nuclear age. And the chilling thing about the power of nuclear weapons is that there's no secret about it. Everybody knows about the scale of horrendous potential damage in those weapons. But precisely because we all do know, we have actually lived at peace, because everybody understands, both in the Soviet Union and in the NATO alliance, that there could never be a winner in any war of that sort.
Exactly. That's why it's so appalling to think that there might be such a war. Can you really say you have the unshakable conviction that the deterrent will always continue to deter as it's deterred, as you've just said, for the last 40 years?
I believe that is the case. And I think that it is precisely because we all know of the horrendous capabilities that your film has shown that deterrent will work. Because nobody who's in a position to have any influence at all, and I say this of those who run the Soviet Union just as much as those who run the NATO alliance, nobody could countenance the use of those weapons. And so whenever the sort of examples that the films shows to indicate how it could happen confront us, actually sanity has prevailed. And that is the message that is missing from this film.
The message that we've had sanity so far, but can you honestly, looking at human history, guarantee that sane, reasonable people will continue to handle this weapon in the future? Are there not real risks involved?
But
will it never fail, or might it never fail?
Looking at history, nobody has ever had weapons of this sort before. We've certainly had horror capability before. I mean, many of us lived through the first films of the appalling consequences of Belsen. We know that 20 million people died in the Soviet Union in the last war. We remember the saturation bombing. We've seen horror before, but we've never had within human capability the absolute horror situation of nuclear power.
But surely, therefore, all the more reason to consider that it might be
This is the difference that has actually brought about this capacity of the two sides, if you like, Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union on the one hand, NATO on the other, whenever faced with the very dangerous situations that in another generation could have escalated to war, has actually produced a situation where people have backed off. And I believe that it is absolutely critical that we remember that, because the fear that I have, if we don't, is that we will change the defense policies that actually have kept that peace.
Mr. Heseltine, may I put this to you?
Certainly.
All that film was doing, at the most, was to question the success of our defence policies. You are implying, almost, that we have no right to question the defence policies of today.
Well, I don't think that that's compatible with the advice that I gave, that I thought people should watch this film. Because, you see, I think that that film actually is the most powerful argument for our defence policies.
And are you glad it was made?
Well, I believe in the widest possible debate in a democracy. I can't help but contrast the fact that that film will never be seen behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union won't let their people see that film.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I can't help contrasting your interview with us, for which I thank you very much, with the fact that you, in fact, would not take part in the subsequent debate.
Well, can I just answer that point? Because that is a very important point. I think that that film has a message of propaganda. And I think it is critically important, therefore, that I should have the chance to answer it. And I do not believe that I would be doing that adequately if I was set in a context where I was being balanced within itself. I wanted, and I believe rightly, to balance the film.
But I must just repeat the point. It is surely very authoritarian to suggest that it is propaganda if one questions defence policy and suggests that the present defence policy might not succeed.
I don't believe it is authoritarian. When I was faced with the decision, as you put to me, do I think people should watch the film, I said I thought they should. Now, that is encouraging debate, but when the film is shown, I believe that there should be a real debate, and that is why I asked for the opportunity to comment upon it, so there would be a balance to the discussion. If I hadn't had such a chance, I believe there would have been an unbalanced position, and I think that that would be wrong and not in the highest keepings of the democratic tradition. And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond.
If somebody made a film about an international crisis in which the deterrent was a success and did work, would that be unbalanced?
But constantly people are, and constantly there are the opportunities to discuss these matters.
But you don't say they're unbalanced.
If somebody wanted at a senior level in a government to ask for the opportunity to comment, you'd have to take a decision as to whether or not you should allow them. But the important thing is that up to now in this country, broadly, there has been a consensus of views about the defence policies that we have pursued. If there had not been such a consensus and such a film had been made in the hypothetical situation you put to me, I dare say people would have asked to comment on it, and I dare say you would have given them the opportunity, and you would have been right to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Heseltine.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Dennis Healy, who is also in London, what was your reaction to that film, and do you agree with Mr. Heseltine about it?
I don't agree with Mr. Heseltine, but I think the film and the issues it is concerned with are far more important than individuals. I think my first reaction, like almost everybody who watched it, was emotional horror, because it shows that a nuclear war would produce a situation which was the abomination of desolation and the four horsemen of the apocalypse riding over a desert. And you must recognize that the film does not represent the full horror of the reality, because scientists now agree that if there were a nuclear exchange on that scale, then smoke and radioactive dust would form a cloud which would blot out the sun, and the whole of Europe, Asia, and the United States and Canada would suffer from icy night for 12 whole months.
So in a way, the film didn't go far enough.
It didn't really, and I think the other emotion one must feel is anger at governments which deliberately misrepresent the truth. Mr. Heseltine, for example, said that nobody claims you can win a nuclear war, but the fact is that President Reagan's National Security Council has issued a defense directive, number 13, I think it is, which says that the purpose of American policy is to prevail, that's to say to win, in a protracted nuclear war. His Undersecretary for Defense responsible for nuclear matters said that if we have enough shovels, everyone will get through. His Civil Defense Organization issued a booklet saying that radiation is rather like sunlight.
Mr. Healy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we will be coming on to those matters in the second half of the programme when you will have an opportunity to intervene, of course, from London. Could I just for the moment ask Dr. Owen what he thought of the film?
I think my first reaction was a sort of sense of numbing and a feeling that the whole thing is one in which one wants perhaps a pause. I'm not sure I want a political argument now. I want cool and fairly rational thought about where we are to go next. I think the film is reasonably fair and accurate. I don't actually agree with Michael that it's propaganda. I think the crucial question that we have to ask ourselves is the events that led up to it, are they realistic? Unfortunately, they are. I personally think it concentrates on that most crucial thing, which is battlefield nuclear weapons. And I think this is what we've ignored. We've talked about strategic weapons, we've talked about Pershing crews, we've not talked about tactical nuclear weapons, which is the thing that triggered this war. And the 3 nuclear airbursts over the advancing Russian forces when they'd made a conventional breakthrough in Europe is part of the strategy of both the Warsaw Pact and of NATO. I think it's the wrong strategy, and I think, therefore, it's very important that we'll talk about that, and I think that film is true and honest. It gives us a fairly accurate interpretation.
We will indeed be talking about that, Dr. Owen. Thank you, and Mr. Healy and Mr. Heseltine. Now, let's have some words from our audience here, and Jane Walmsley.
Well, as we've said, there are people here tonight with varying shades of opinion. Perhaps the one thing we have in common is a very clear idea of what's at stake. So your reactions, please, to the aftermath of nuclear war as seen in that film. If I can start with the lady in the second row here with the checked shirt.
Yes, I am a parent, a mother of a small child, and of course I felt absolutely desperate and very saddened about it. It just doesn't bear thinking about. One point I'd like to make is that it shows the hopelessness of civil defence plans, and certainly for people with small children.
Right, we'll be moving on to that point later. Can I take the gentleman sitting about 4 rows back there with the dark blue jacket on? Did you feel any more encouraged by the film than anybody else?
I didn't think it went far enough, really.
In what way?
I think it should have been more stronger than what it was.
Strong, that wasn't bad enough, that the reality would be worse.
Exactly.
All right, let's try. When the film was shown in America, there was a great deal of discussion about whether school children ought to be allowed to see it. We have some fifth formers from Leicester here tonight. Can I take the fellow with the burgundy scarf around his neck about 4 rows back there? What did you think? Are you glad you're here?
Yeah, I'm glad actually that people like us were having an opportunity to see it, because I don't feel that enough is shown about the horrors of nuclear war to people, well, everyone, not just people of our age. And in a way I'm quite glad that it's shown later, because it's a very horrible film.
All right, so you're glad you weren't protected. We have a lady here called Mrs. Bowers, Mrs. Daphne Bowers, the lady in the black cardigan. You happen to have a bunker at the bottom of your garden, Mrs. Bowers.
That's right.
Why?
Well, as the situation is, we think we needed it.
What would you do if the moment came and the missiles were on their way?
Well, if my children weren't there, I wouldn't want to be there. My children are my life. I brought them into the world to live, not to die.
So if you were separated from your children at the moment of impact, you would do what?
I'd stay out. I don't want to live if my children can't live.
And there we'll have to leave it for a moment. There will be more from the audience later in the program.
You'll remember that in the day after, the Russians had launched 300 missiles of military and industrial targets all over America. Now, all the evidence suggests that a similar attack on Britain would be even more catastrophic, because we're much more densely populated with suitable targets and people. Indeed, it's estimated that perhaps 30 or even 40 million of us might die. That appalling prospect is the kind of nightmare that's been closely studied by people like Sir Leslie Mavor, who's a civil defence specialist from the Home Office, and by Dr. John Dawson, one of the authors of a report published by the BMA called The Medical Effects of Nuclear War. Dr. Dawson, first briefly, do you think that that film accurately describes the aftermath of nuclear war from a medical point of view?
Well, the film of the bomb exploding was, as far as I can tell, a genuine film taken from the United States atmospheric tests in the 50s. You remember a shot there of a house literally exploding. That's known as the 4 PSI house. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's another point about the film, though, which is incorrect. First of all, the drugs would run out much more quickly, I think, than was suggested in the film. And secondly, medically, you'd have to question whether it was worth burying the bodies in a time when you're making very hard choices. I doubt that you would be burying the bodies in that rather neat American way.
Those scenes were very chaotic. There was no medical assistance virtually for the vast bulk of the people who had arrived at the hospital in hope of getting it. Would that be the case in Britain as well? Yes.
If you look at the average nuclear attack that we looked at in the report, we looked at a single bomb, first of all, over a population centre, and in our view, more casualties than can be coped with in all the acute beds in the National Health Service in England.
Just one bomb would...
Over a population centre would create more casualties than you could look after in the acute beds to the standards that we now think are desirable. When you have a major attack, and that, in our view, would be likely because human nature is that it tends to go on attacking while it can. If you have a major attack, then you get overlapping effects and you get breakdowns in the transport and communications networks that allow the National Health Service to function. And there comes a point quite quickly where the possibility of providing anything other than first aid, and that wouldn't be by a doctor, would be quite remote.
In one word, is that a complete breakdown of the medical services?
It's a breakdown of the medical services as you know them now, yes.
Sir Leslie Mavor, in the light of the film and what we've just heard from the BMA, and in the light of what one of the women was saying in the audience there, what are we talking about when we use the term civil defence?